Heap on more wood, the wind is chill, but let it whistle as it will, we'll keep our Christmas merry still. Each age has deemed the newborn year the fittest time for festal cheer. Even, heathen yet, the savage Dane at Yule more deep the mead did drain. High on the beach his galleys drew, and feasted all his pirate crew. Then in his low and pine-bit built hall, where shields and axes decked the wall, they gorged upon the half-dressed deer, caroused in seas of sable beer, while round in brutal jest were thrown the half-gnawed ribbed, the marrow bone, or listened all in grim delight, while scolds yelled out the joys of fight. Then forth, in frenzy would they hie, while wildly loose their red locks fly, and dancing round the blazing pile, they make such barbarous mirth the while, as best might to the mind recall the boisterous joys of Odin's hall. And well our Christian sires of old loved when the year its course had rolled, and brought blithe Christmas back again with all his hospitable train. Domestic and religious rite gave honour to the holy night. On Christmas Eve the bells were rung. On Christmas Eve the Mass was sung. That only night in all the year saw the stoled priest the chalice rear. The damsel donned her kirtle sheen. The hall was dressed with holly green. Forth to the wood did merry men go to gather in the mistletoe. Then opened wide the baron's hall to vassal, tenant, serf, and all. Power laid his rod of rule aside, and ceremony doffed his pride. The heir, with roses in his shoes, that night might village partner choose. The lord, underrogating, share the vulgar game of post and pair. All hailed with uncontrolled delight, and general voice the happy night, that to the cottage, as the crown, brought tidings of salvation down. The fire with well-dried logs supplied went roaring up the chimney wide. The huge hall table's oaken face, scrubbed till it shone the day to grace, bore then upon its massive board no mark to part the squire and lord. Then was brought in the lusty brawn by old blue-coated serving man. Then the grim boar's head frowned on high, crested with bays and rosemary. Well can the green-garbed ranger tell how, when, and where the monster fell, what dogs before his death he tore, and all the baiting of the boar. The wassail round in good brown bowls, garnished with ribbons blithely trolls. There the huge sirloin reeked. Hard by plum porridge stood, and Christmas pie. Nor failed old Scotland to produce, at such high tide, her savoury goose. Then came the merry maskers in, and carols roared with blithesome din. If unmelodious was the song, it was a hearty note, and strong. Who lists may in their mumming see traces of ancient mystery. White shirts supplied the masquerade, and smutted cheeks the visors made. But, oh, what maskers, richly dight, can boast of bosoms half so light? England was merry England, when old Christmas brought his sports again. 'Twas Christmas broached the mightiest ale, 'twas Christmas told the merriest tale. A Christmas gambol oft could cheer the poor man's heart through half the year. Well, hello and welcome everybody. It's good to see you all here again. Today we are doing another episode of English Restoration. Last time we looked at Robin Hood and his merry men, and it just seems so fitting to move from the merriment of Sherwood Forest to Merry England, as it were, and Merry Christmas. And with me today I have two fantastic guests. First and foremost, I want to introduce a guest to the show, Justine Brown's Bookshelf. Hello, Justine.
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure. For those of the audience who don't know who you are, could you say a little bit about your channel that you make, that you do videos on, and kind of your interest in English history?
Yeah, my channel is largely focuses on the 17th century, although not uniquely. I have some bits here and there on other interests like you Thomas More and Utopia. Also, the pre-Raphaelites are some of my great favorites. But I studied the 17th century at in graduate school, and I came back to it.
Hmm,
So I'm very interested in the English Civil War and also the Jacobites. I'm working on a biography of James II right now. So um, everything that I've done on my channel has kind of led up to this right now. So I
oh,
have a whole series
fantastic.
on that.
And what captures your imagination and interest in the 17th century in particular?
Well, it's such a kind of dramatic century in that there's a lot of it's kind of the emergence of modernity, but also you have like I feel like there is kind of pushback, especially coming from the Cavaliers and then later from the Jacobites, trying to recover that dimension of England that was really started to be heavily attacked under Henry VIII. So we kind of have the chickens coming home to roost. I mean, Henry VIII tried to he seemed to be grabbing for more power for the monarchy, but ironically, as Chesterton shows, his actions actually weaken the monarchy in the long term because once the new class that he emboldened had finished looting the monasteries, they then turned around and started looting the monarchy in the English Civil War, and we see like a with the execution of Charles I, which I believe we've never recovered from fully. I don't think even with the Restoration, I think the monarchy was still uh, corroded, impoverished, and Charles II and James II both tried hard to pull back some of that traditional power, but as we know, with James II, that was he was deposed, and so we have a kind of monarchy that is emblematic ever since then, I think. Yeah. So it's a time when we really see like an effort on the behalf of reactionary forces to try to recover our traditions, but you know, I mean, they largely failed, although we do see a kind of effort to fight back in the 18th century, and then the 19th century, another effort to fight back. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think even the topic today, Merry England, the passage I read from Walter Scott, William Hazlitt probably popularized the term in Victorian England. Seems at that time there was a real attempt to try and recover some of those things that had been lost through, initially the kind of Puritan attack upon it, and then later rationalist kind of religion and morality pushing it to the side. It seems the 19th century there was a desire to
Recapture it in some way.
yeah, and restore some of those gems, even if it's just in a novel like Ivanhoe or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Walter Scott is kind of a romantic in that sense that he wants to recapture folklore,
Hmm.
um, and you see that in I read, oh gosh, I mean, he wrote several books about the Jacobite rebellions that he subtitled the oh gosh, what is it? Something Quixote. Like he kind of compared what Bonnie Prince Charlie was trying to do to sort of a quixotic effort to recover the past in a way that it almost seems like just pure romanticism, like they kind of almost like he's given up on a real recovery, but it is a constant impulse through the 19th century. And that's quite why I like the pre-Raphaelites, because the pre-Raphaelites really represent a return to the mythos of Britain with the Arthurian legends, for example, and the 19th century is kind of remarkable in that combination of, on the one hand, all that like industrialized power of industrialization, on the other hand, like a true kind of traditionalist impulse combined, which in some ways seems ideal. But
well, on the topic of Arthurian restoration, I should introduce my other guest, which is Rupert August. Hello, Rupert. How are you doing?
Good to be back again. Funnily enough, on the topic of the Pre-Raphaelites, there's currently an exhibition ongoing in London in the William Morris Gallery, I think, specifically showing off some of the Arthurian work that was produced by many of them.
Yes, some of us attended that a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I would have joined you myself actually, but I couldn't at the time, so I've had to go up like recently, last weekend I think it was, or the weekend before.
Yeah, it's quite a nice. It's a beautiful place. Like everybody should visit William Morris's childhood home, and they've but it's just the Arthurian exhibition is small, but they've chosen some really nice examples, and also there's a Rossetti family exhibition is coming up at the Tate in April, so that's another thing that people should look out for.
Very nice. One thing I should say as well is that although even if some of these attempts to resurrect the spirit of Merry England, one might say, or the traditional form of England pre-execution of Charles I, or you could say perhaps even pre-Henry VIII, or any other time you choose to pick. At the very least, even if they did fail, they kept the ember alive so that future generations could give it a go. So,
and here we are, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's some solace in that, perhaps. But on that note, should we perhaps lay out what Merry England actually is? Because if one were to consult Wikipedia, they wouldn't necessarily get the biggest or the most perfect picture of it. It's classed under the utopia subgenre, you might say.
Yeah, well, just to elucidate that point, when I started to do research on this, you look at the Wikipedia article and it's basically saying Merry England never existed. It's a fiction and a fantasy which conservative and reactionary voices believe was in the past, but never was really there. Actually, when we deconstruct it all, it was this horrible patriarchal, misogynist society, and there was no such thing as Merry England. But I mean, that's typical of a lot of modern scholarship, right? Everything is awful in the past.
Yeah, fits into a common pattern. It was never like this. It's always been it was never like that. It's always been like this. So stop trying to make anything different to how it is now.
Terrible prejudice against the past. I mean, to bring up Morris again, he's kind of an interesting figure because he was a socialist, but also he did look to the past as an inspiration for something he felt had been lost with industrialization. I think he was quite successful in, in certain respects, trying to reify that. But, any of us who have attended a Christmas dinner or have gone to a beautiful mass at Christmas time or something, we know that these things exist and that they're still alive, that they happen,
One thing that very definitely came through for me in it was a book that you sent. Do you remember what the name of it was, Nathan?
Do you know which book you're?
Rise and Fall of Merry England is what it was.
Oh yes, Ronald Hutter, I think it was, or Hutton. Yeah.
So one thing that was emphasized there is the idea that there was like a whole calendar of feast days, for one thing, and festivals and such. And although, and that would perhaps be, you could say, what constituted Merry England in large part, because a lot of the other things are sort of outcroppings from this general theme and this general calendar. And although most of them were stripped away in the Reformation, a select few were sort of kept on. Christmas being obviously one of the main ones, because it's a more fundamental, Christ's Mass. It's a more fundamentally Christian, or at least can be rehabilitated into being more fundamentally Christian before it was sort of diverted away towards more commercialist ends. But so you could perhaps think about it in the sense of Christmas being a period that is slightly emblematic of what was once a lot more wide of a feeling or a milieu in which the English found themselves.
Yeah, a great deal is invested in Christmas because we've had so many other feasts stripped away. Kind of, it's the one that we really, heavily load with what is left. I think of that. But yeah, that sense of kind of ebb and flow, the calendar, the year, the seasons, the cyclical nature. I mean, these things are real. Seasons are real, and the church built its calendar around those seasons.
Well, maybe at this point it'd be good just to bring in William Hazlitt's essay. Hazlitt was the figure who really popularized the term Merry England within a 19th century context. And although he's not particularly addressing the medieval aspect, he's trying to draw out characteristics of the English. But I think at the very beginning of the essay, there's a section where he kind of talks about the calendar and its particular importance for the English conception of merriment. So I might just read a bit of it, and then we can continue discussing this aspect. The smile is not the less sincere because it does not always play upon the cheek, and the jest is not the less welcome, nor the laugh less hearty, because they happen to be a relief from care or leaden-eyed melancholy. The instances are the more precious as they are rare, and we look forward to them with the greater goodwill, or back upon them with the greater gratitude, as we drain the last drop in the cup with particular relish. If not always gay or in good spirits, we are glad when any occasion draws us out of our natural gloom and disposed to make the most of it. We may say with silence in the play, I have been merry once ere now, and this once was to serve all his life. For he was a person of wonderful silence and gravity, though he chirped over his cups and announced with characteristic glee that there were pippins and cheese to come. Silence was in this sense a merry man, that is, he would be merry if he could, and a very great economy of wit, like very slender fare, was a banquet to him, from the simplicity of his taste and habits. Continents, says Thomas Hobbes, have most of what they contain, and in this view it may be contended that the English are the merriest people in the world, since they only show it on high days and holidays. They are then like a schoolboy let loose from school, or like a dog that has slipped his collar. They are not gay like the French, who are one eternal smile of self-complacency, tortured into affectation or spun out into languid indifference. Nor are they voluptuous and immersed in sensual indolence like the Italians, but they have that sort of intermittent, fitful, irregular gaiety, which is neither worn out by habit nor deadened by passion, but is sought with avidity as it takes the mind by surprise, is startled by a sense of oddity and incongruity, indulges its wayward humours or lively impulses with perfect freedom and lightness of heart, and seizes occasion by the forelock, that it may return to serious business with more cheerfulness, and have something to beguile the hours of thought or sadness. I do not see how there can be high spirits without low ones, and everything has its price according to circumstances. And I guess what really jumped out to me in this passage was this sense with the calendar in the English context of, in Advent, you have this, in the medieval context, you have a very strict fasting period, where there's very little in the ways of feast days. And then with Christmas, we only celebrate the one day, really, maybe with Boxing Day. Then they had a 12-day period up to Epiphany. And this whole period was one in which people weren't meant to work, or if they worked, it was to help prepare for feasting and partying and revelry. So there's this very intense release of joy compared to the stark, harsh winter fast before. So it seems he's caught onto something there of the sharp contrasts.
It's almost as if, in a weird way, the 12 days of Christmas have been transposed backwards for, because people do seem to, feast rather heartily through December, You know, I mean, I try to practice Advent. It's really hard to do that in this, where everybody's having parties all the time, right? But nonetheless, we do have a sort of, a slightly extended Christmas period still, I think, but that, yeah, the kind of comparison between the contrast of the calendar, with the contrast in the English spirit, I think that's quite apt. And then there's the seasons by definition have that kind of sense of you appreciate something all the more because it it's not always there.
I think. Sorry, go ahead, Justine.
I was going to say, inevitably, I think something of the spirit comes forth in the pub culture in Britain as well. Just that people are in the context of work, they can be quite reserved and not even especially merry or playful. But when they get to the pub, I mean, alcohol is obviously a factor, but it does seem like people let their hair down in a certain context, but not in others, right?
Well, you could perhaps say that some amount of that spirit comes through in the phrase that you often hear: "Work hard, play hard."
Mm-hmm.
You hear that in a lot of workplaces where they will try to very deliberately put on this hard contrast between how they are in the office and how they are in a more relaxed social setting, but exist together as a group throughout, basically. So they're acting as a more unified group and have this hard contrast.
And there's kind of a bonding that goes on. I do think merry old England survives to some degree in that pub life, which is what makes it all the more distressing when you hear that pubs are being driven out of business by energy prices and things like this.
Yes, certainly, but I suppose it depends on then whether we think that it was kept alive from the bottom up more so or the top down, because I think that there's some conflict, let's say, on which side that comes from, because you could look at it from the ecclesiastical side, I suppose, and take the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation as being an endpoint of this, because it was no longer receiving the same amount of patronage from above. So you cease to have the clergy being facilitating a lot of these types of festivals and such. But Hazlitt, I believe, kind of mentions that it's a little bit more bottom up, and it's something that is just felt within the spirit of the English, and it just sort of emerges out of how they behave, almost regardless of what context you put them in. I seem to remember him emphasizing the point that Englishmen will be very keen, even if they're within the great metropolis of London. And this is unlike Frenchmen, he says, that they will want to escape and go back to the countryside and back to the village, whereas Frenchmen will more happily stay within the confines of Paris.
Yeah. I wonder if, that bubbling up came through in the Christmas rebellions that happened under Cromwell in the 1650s. You hear about this, that, apparently there were like regular uprisings during that period, even though he was using, I use Cromwell in a kind of, obviously symbolizes like a much larger elite, but supposedly they used the New Model Army to put down Christmas revelry everywhere they found it, but it still kept happening. And sometimes it was a way to channel kind of political energy as well. It's quite an interesting.
Although that would also act as a very good pretext for why it's necessary to crack down on it and not to engender too much support from the public. So I guess one has to bear that in mind. But yeah, you can certainly believe that something as simple as enjoying the festivities that you always have can be a focal point for gathering discontents.
Yes, yeah. I mean, they do say that some people claim that the effort to snuff out pub culture today might actually be intentional, for the same reason that like pubs attract people who tend to be kind of against the regime, and then they gather and talk, plan and plot in real life.
Well, there's a similar phenomenon with football hooliganism. It's sort of way past its high tide now, but that was quite a big thing some years ago now, and there was a very concerted effort from the top down to crush that and try to break apart the networks that were sort of facilitating football hooliganism, and perhaps under a similar sort of pretext, because you can kind of see elsewhere what can happen when football hooliganism isn't cracked down on. It becomes like a very notable nexus for sort of militia type activities and an organization of a very violent nature. But I mean, there is also just the element of bringing together this merriment
Strong
side of things
men.
as well. Yeah. So
strong young men gathering, right?
Strong young men gathering. They're often drinking, engaging in merriment, but they're also doing so, to bring it back to Hazlitt, in the sporting context, because Hazlitt also mentions and emphasizes quite significantly the role of sports, and in particular for England, because we have been the fount of so many different types of sports, and how that has sort of interacted with what the central state wants from us over time has been a sort of constant back and forth. So the state tries to attack, well, most famously football, because it was perceived as interrupting or getting in the way of people practicing longbow like a good citizen ought, to anachronistically use the term.
Interesting, yeah, because I mean, people heard all around the world. People heard about like the English hooliganism, but it might be worth like going deeper to see if there was as you suggest, there does seem to be a potential political dimension to that as well.
Well,
I
think as well. Sorry, go ahead, Rupert.
Well, I was just going to say very quickly, but also coming under the gathering under the purview of sports, basically, as something which is potentially subversive to what it's more in the vein of Merry England, you might say. So if we're drawing out this sketch of what Merry England is and was, then sport is at least to Hazlitt, and I'm inclined to agree, is a very integral part of that.
But I think there's an art to directing, potentially violent energy, and that the traditions that we're going to on, like the Lords of Misrule, for example. These sort of if elites get this right, they can kind of channel this energy in a way that eventually reifies the social structure. And we may, if we like the social structure, that seems appealing. I do like the medieval social structure, so that seems appealing to me. The idea that a regular kind of purging of kind of chaotic elements through something like the Lords of Misrule, which would like invert the social hierarchy on a kind of festive basis, would serve to like let off steam, basically, and then people could go back to normal the next day, sort of thing. But if you don't handle it properly, then you could end up with rebellions and revolutions.
Yeah.
Well, this ties into a point that Alexandra Shepherd talks about in her book about masculinity in early modern England, and she sees she tries to go beyond the kind of simple patriarchy model and say, well, actually, you have multiple masculinities within early modern England, and at the top you have the patriarch who rules the household, usually a propertied man with a family and servants and so on, will have some status within the community. Maybe he's on the church board, the town council, etc., etc. And he wants to govern with order. Everything must be subordinate to him within his family, and then within the community at large, these men should be at the top and others need to kind of obey them. And if they don't, that's when disorder enters into the community and needs to be punished. But then you have unmarried young men who aren't at that level yet. And for them, the kind of greatest expression of masculinity is being a kind of daring character who defies that order, who maybe goes and proves himself by drinking down at the pub and romancing various young maidens and getting in fist fights with other young men to show his gallantry. And in a way, to me, what you were alluding to, Rupert and Justine, this kind of naughtiness mixed with bravado can be seen in sport. So, and kind of proving, and Hazlitt even talks about the English desire to have a rap on the knuckles and be thrilled by the kind of adventurousness of that. I think you can see that channeled in various forms of sport. He mentions boxing in particular, that at that time no nation really had boxing in the way England did, but yet people love boxing in this country, and particularly amongst the working classes nowadays, which I think is an interesting dynamic. But then other sorts of adventurism. Obviously, at that time, you had the British Empire and colonialism. And so young men could go out into the world and kind of stake themselves by proving themselves in the army, for example. So I would see some of this dialectic of Puritan and Merry England as a kind of these two masculinities, perhaps at some kind of warring fault line.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's again, it's sort of, if the elites, it's sort of up to them to be able to handle that other masculinity in a fruitful way. You know, if they can't handle it in a fruitful way, you know, then it's gonna, things will probably get ugly. And not to get too political, but I do wonder about today, like where the elites think they're going with, you know, suppressing the ordinary males and kind of vilifying them, denouncing them, and sort of, you know, I do wonder where they're going with that, because, you know, young men are really not, you know, going anywhere, so you can drug them, I suppose. But,
yeah, sedate them into non-resistance. A brave new world brought into being. Rupert, you've actually written on this topic quite extensively.
So yeah, the topic of what to do with sort of energies. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, but I'm wondering if it's basically just misguided, essentially, the way they're going about it, because it would perhaps be more. You could perhaps talk about it more in an evil genius kind of sense if we had some kind of outlet that was allowing them to just not be present whilst everything is taking place to the liking of whoever wants to do their bidding, you know, the various elites as they exist at the moment. But that doesn't even seem to be happening. So they're given simultaneously no official outlet and no outlet that is there's basically nothing. So what do they do other than operating outside the system? I suppose it
just seems incompetent.
The one thing that might give us pause, though, in this regard is the extent to which we are less less uncivil, I suppose, than peoples before us. So we've been quite sophisticatedly and sufficiently domesticated by this point, and ever more with each passing generation, it seems. So yeah, perhaps they are not worried about it because it genuinely would not be an issue, even if it reaches a fairly critical mass. The amount of people who would actually be trying to revolt against the system to prove their masculinity would be such a small quantity of people that it's not worth being concerned about.
Yeah, well, yes, we shall see, right? It does seem to me, it does seem I mean, like, I guess they're using, you know, various types of drugs, addictive things. I mean, sport in a way does channel it. They, you know, to go back to sport, obviously there's a parallel between sport and warfare, and usually sport is a way to kind of channel, like, you know, violent or competitive impulses when there is no war, you know. But on the other hand, I know quite a few people from the Balkans who said that in the early stages of the Yugoslavian war that it was actually at football games that a lot of the violence ticked off.
Well, funnily enough, that's what I was referring to earlier. So as I understand it, quite a lot of the modern Ukraine war essentially is two factions of the Kharkov FC football hooligan scene.
Okay,
that's kind of where a lot of it comes from. I mean, obviously, if you discount some more like deep-seated issues about that go further into back into the 19th century, the immediate sense of where these two factions come from is just from
two, like, sort of one Russian-oriented and one Ukraine-oriented team or something like that in Ukraine.
No, same team, just two different factions essentially of the same team. At the start, at the very start, a lot of the guys knew each other, like, quite personally.
Wow. Yeah, sounds like the same thing.
Yeah.
So the people need to be careful with you know, using sport as a kind of method to let off steam, if so, right?
Well, yes, because I mean, as you said, it's a gathering of people who are potential malcontents under pretenses that allow them to sort of let off some amount of steam and allow them to sort of cultivate more masculine virtues in some ways, especially if things like hooliganism are tolerated or just accepted.
To go back to our period, apparently Shrove Tuesday, which of course Mardi Gras in our tradition, the day before Ash Wednesday, it was is another one of these kind of carnivalesque festival times, similar to Christmas, and there would be regular riots on Shrove Tuesday, apprentice riots in particular, apparently, because the apprentices were quite a strong political force in the cities in England. But there would sometimes be some like quite ugly things would happen on Shrove Tuesday, apparently. Because the force of the apprentices and then just the mob, the actions of the mob generally in London really fed in heavily into the 17th century kind of political activities. They'd sort of harness these mobs in various ways to support various factions. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how those, even though I think Shrove, the festive tradition was even being de-emphasized by that time, but Shrove Tuesday was still a kind of focal point for these riotous activities.
You also had, so I believe on Twelfth Night, which we'll come to in more detail soon, you had mummers going out, and so these would be individuals who would dress up in disguise, sometimes swapping kind of gender clothes as well, and maybe putting on plays. But they would go around houses asking for money and gifts of various kinds. Christmas is coming, the beef is getting fat, please put a penny in the old man's hat. That song comes from that tradition. But at the same time, a lot of these people in disguise were committing violent crimes and robberies because nobody knew who they were, so they could get away with it in the dead of night. And that was one of the, well, at least a pretext for why Henry VIII explicitly banned mummery on Twelfth Night, because it had this association with violence and criminal activity. So it seems there's a strong connection between the what might seem like innocent pleasures and joys and really indulging in them, and then this more violent streak with it, and that seems to be a pattern that we're noticing across these different areas.
Yeah, it's like you're treading this fine line where you can use these festive traditions to kind of channel the energy and let it off, but then it can also go the other way and you can lose control of it.
Rupert, did you want to add anything there?
I'm just sort of very keen to essentially sketch out in more detail and go into depth about all these different elements that we're talking about, because I'm aware that we're kind of skimming over things in places and not necessarily getting into depth about what the substance is about everything that we're talking about. So in particular, going back to quickly the idea of misrule. So that's quite an interesting one, because you could almost say that it exists in the same sort of tradition as satire, in the form of things like spitting image, I guess, is the closest thing that comes to mind. But the idea that you take the Lord and the ways of the Lord as they presently exist, but then you sort of invert them in a way where it's made a joke in that the people who are put in those positions are very obviously not suited for the role. So in particular, there were cases where there would be a lady who was accompanying the Lord, but this would be an instance of transvestitism, and they would deliberately pick men to put in dresses who were brawny, bearded and very unfeminine in as many different ways as possible, just to sort of like play up this idea of a complete inversion. But at the same time, what it's doing is solidifying the idea that there is almost no other way of doing rule, perhaps you could say. So although you can put other people in the costume, fundamentally you're still I can't help but think that you're still sort of lifting up the structure that you're emulating. But this was something that was very much tolerated by everyone involved. So the clergy and the official lords.
Yep, because they inverted the clergy as well. There were days, the Feast of Fools, for example, was a day when the whole clergy would be mocked, and this would go on in church. But it's limited, right? So it's not tolerated all the time, but it's tolerated on this one day. So I think it's kind of compared. It's almost as though, everyone knows about the fool, right? And many people know that the fool had the kind of right to say certain things to the king that other people didn't have the right to. So you had a kind of, you see this in Shakespeare plays where the fool is kind of there saying, mocking things. And for the most part, the fool survives. Although apparently, to go back to Henry VIII, one time the fool was making fun of him and mocking one of his many wives, or one of his crazy choices, and he freaked out and attacked this person, nearly killed him. So that kind of shows like Henry VIII, right? This guy, I don't know why he's still remembered in some weird way, because he sort of personifies kingship because of his appearance, but like he was a tyrant as far as I'm concerned. He may have started out good, but he became a tyrant, and he was single-handedly did the most to kind of crush merry old England, in the 16th century. But the fool had this power and this ability to kind of mock the king when no one else could, and he could kind of give advice. And so it seems that those days, like the days where the Lords of Misrule would come into play, and Twelfth Night was one of them, and Shrove Tuesday was another. So 12th night being the last night of the 12 days of Christmas, was almost like the fool function kind of extended out beyond that one person for a 24-hour period.
Yeah, so just to clarify, for the audience, the Lords of Misrule, it could be for one day, such as Christmas Day or 12th night, or it could be for the whole period. And this could be in the court, it might be in a city kind of organization, a guild, even just a large household of certain kind. An individual who would not normally be in a position of authority, so not your kind of patriarch, maybe a servant of some kind, will be uplifted to the position of authority, and people have to be subservient to them. And so this is an inversion of the social order. At the same time, you also have an inversion of social values. So they are to encourage revelry, drinking to excess, feasting to excess, licentiousness of various kinds. And so maybe indulging in some of those, the deadly sins in certain ways. And
I wanted to say as well, in some ways they can be considered to enjoying all the perks of rule without actually having any of the responsibilities. So in some ways they're enjoying. It's almost like a sword of Damocles situation, but if the sword were cut down, but only for a day.
Yeah, and that I think it had a way of maybe siphoning off envy as well, because you had this kind of potential anyway for one day to kind of dress up and be this powerful person, at least in a kind of playful way.
Yes, exactly. But famously, it also, just to illustrate some possible, I suppose, perennial qualities of this tradition, it's also something that quite famously pops up in Saturnalia as well, where the patricians and the slaves would sort of swap, the slave owners and the slaves would swap roles, and one would serve the other for a day. Well, the patricians would serve the slaves rather than vice versa for a day.
Yeah. The tradition extends back into Roman times. Yeah, it seems to be very intrinsic to our culture anyway. There's a Russian thinker, Bakhtin, who wrote quite well about this. He articulated the idea of the carnivalesque. So in literature, sort of broadly, but yeah, we see it a lot. Shakespeare is a very good, cataloger of some of these practices, and they're there at least in a kind of trace form, because a lot of them had been already kind of dying off, but he refers to a lot of these things in his play. So it's very, especially with the comedy, is very instructive.
Well, to get back to some of the historical placing of all this, then the Elizabethan era in particular is quite interesting in this regard, because it seems to represent a sort of not necessarily a proper official revival of a lot of the traditions after Edward VI had sort of like cracked down on them, and before that, Henry VIII had sort of allowed some of the cracking down on them, but Elizabeth represented just a bit of a permissiveness to allow certain things to return without being punished quite severely as they had been prior. So you kind of get probably the most recent sense, and especially through Shakespeare, of what some of these times were like, but still in a very degraded form compared to what they were pre Henry VIII, for example.
Yeah, it's like people would watch, a play about what used to happen, kind of, right? What more people would have participated in, I guess.
Yeah.
But this is one reason why the Puritans were very sort of suspicious of the theater. I think there are a whole host of reasons why, but this is one of them, that they kind of encapsulate or reify this tradition that they don't like. They also explicitly associated it with the Mass because of the sacrificial kind of quality that theater has.
Curious. I've always wondered at the actual reasons that were given, because I just assumed that it came under the purview of moral degeneracy and everything that was associated with the theatre, not necessarily what the theatre was in its intrinsic sense, rather than just what it's associated with.
Yeah, they explicitly, because you have this, especially in tragedy, right? Going back to the Greeks, you have this actual sacrifice that happens, on stage. The sacrifice of that is tragedy, and you see somebody fall and that person dies, and then there's the release of the catharsis, right? Because a similar thing happens in Mass. The Puritans were quite explicit about this. They saw the theater. So they didn't like tragedy for that reason. They didn't like comedy because of the festive cycle that it invoked that we're talking about now. But they also talked about things like, just people misbehaving and, disease and whatever. They had and just that they classified acting as prostitution, which is kind of a funny thing to say, especially in the context of today when actors have such so high status. It's kind of funny to kind of think of it like that, but they just sort of thought well, these people are just pretending something, they're prostitutes. So it's funny, but I disapprove of their expression of the theaters, but they did say some amusing things sometimes.
But I think as well, there's also this idea, and it's very much in the ballad tradition too, that the Puritans see it as working in the soul, or moving the soul to experience the emotions expressed within the ballad or in the play. So if you're seeing some, an illicit romantic encounter, for them it actually kind of works that emotion within you, or that desire, and so you're kind of compelled to then engage in it yourself. And so yeah, exactly. So you imitate what you've seen or heard. And so you have this idea of the eyes are the windows of the soul, and thus they must be protected. So it's very much this idea of removing the possible occasions of sin is critical. And so that's why you also, on one level, need to ban Christmas, not only because it comes from the liturgical calendar, which has its associations with the medieval Catholic calendar, but also because it's an occasion where you might, and if you're listening to the Lord of Misrule, you're probably going to end up committing a number of sins. So we need to get rid of that.
Yes, and the fact that because you no longer have confession and the cycle of to kind of work to something to it's a major theological dispute in Christianity, right? Whether the status of confession, but it's certainly the case that if you in Catholicism you have it's kind of assumed that you are going to sin to some degrees, but you also can go to confession and kind of reform yourself. But they didn't like they didn't like to, I guess, to have a cycle where it was almost inevitable, I guess, that you're going to sin. There's going to be,
Well, in medieval penitential kind of understanding of the sacrament of confession, you have this idea of, every sin is a kind of amount of pleasure that you've gained. You need to pay off through satisfaction. So that doesn't determine whether you're forgiven or not, but it's something kind of righting the offense to God and to society.
Yeah.
And so the calendar reflects that, because you have a period where you might indulge in some of this pleasure, but then you have a period where it's pain, essentially. You pay off the pleasure with the pain. Whereas in the Puritan worldview, the whole of life is to be 100% given to God. There's no kind of release and return, or paying off a pleasure. That's not really there in the same way. It's kind of removed, and part because of the changes to the legal system also take place during this period, and I think that's reflected in Puritanism. So, but I think then, so that you can see the theological difference manifesting in the calendar very strongly.
Yeah, indeed. That the calendar is basically shorn. I mean, people are quite surprised to learn that. I think a lot of people, when they hear Christmas was canceled, they sort of think, oh, I guess everyone was in church, but actually everyone wasn't in church. You weren't even supposed to go to church. You're supposed to maybe mark Christmas with, and they didn't like the word Christmas because it had the word mass in it. But you were meant to mark it with prayer and kind of self-discipline, but something very interior, and not really kind of marked in a communal sense, so that actually, is actually not, the only day for church was Sunday and not any other days, no exceptional days, right? And that also applied to Easter, as far as I understand.
Yeah, that's right.
Keeping with this, sorry, continue. I was going to take it off in a slightly different direction.
Well, just a very short point. In Scotland, which I guess is proto-Puritanism in England, right? That's what the Puritans looked to as an example or a model.
Yeah.
They didn't use the words Easter and Christmas. It was Pasch and Yuletide. So they actually removed the possible language aspect of it too. And in the Scottish context, it went even further than Anglicanism. There was no kind of holy days, essentially. It was just the Sunday that was permitted as a holy day. There wasn't special feast days, I guess. Rupert, go ahead.
Well, so in keeping with the same idea, I'm unaware, actually. Maybe Justine. Did they try and ban sports as well, the Puritans?
Yeah, to quite a large degree, yes. A lot of anything that might involve gambling, I think was. But I believe football also came in for a certain amount of cancellation.
Yeah, so we're kind of. I was just going to say we're kind of sketching out an idea of what England is, almost in Merry England is, almost in reverse of just everything that the Puritans disliked. Which I was aware that this sort of dialectic existed, but I didn't quite know how deep.
Yeah, no, it's amazing what the list. When you look at the list, it is kind of an itemization really of merry old England.
Well, and again with sorry, Justine, carry on.
Oh, I just thought I might quickly read a verse from a song from the period that I came across. Am I gone? Am I back?
You're back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Can you? Are we okay?
I think so.
Oh dear.
So.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to try. It's just a quick verse. It's a song, a royalist cavalier song that kind of lists some of the Christmas items that were lost. So to conclude, I'll tell you the news that's right. Christmas was killed at Naseby fight. Charity was slain at that same time. Jack tell truth too, a friend of mine. Likewise then did die, roast beef and shred pie, pig, goose, and capon lament. You see the world turned upside down. So we have a kind of little list of Christmas foods here. Roast beef and shred pie, which I think might be mince pie, pig, goose, and capon. And then what is interesting is the world turned upside down, which actually is like similar to the Lord's Misrule model, right? But when the English Civil War happened and the Puritans came in, the Royalists perceived this as if, like, well, I guess it was like a permanent Lent and no Easter, you know, that the world turned upside down for them, but there was no relief from it.
Mm.
That was one of the most common kind of refrains during that time, was that the world had turned upside down. I think clown world is sort of what they had. It felt like to them, right?
Yeah. The other notable thing is that they didn't, that they weren't. So the replacement was not wearing quite the same veneer as what it replaced. And so that's probably quite a distinctive difference, but it sort of hints at a lot of the same. And but it becomes a lot more sinister then, of course, when it's not trying to play by the same kind of rules. It's trying to create something entirely new and chart out its own very serious direction.
Yeah, I guess I mean, their governing strategy obviously did fall apart. So it may be that it's just not a successful formula for this country. Although I think it did work more in America, because we did see, of course, a huge amount of Puritans go to America and govern New England in this fashion for quite a long time.
But even that abates.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see a similar thing in Scotland, I think, where the Scots have this much more strict and rigid Calvinism, and it's really only in the late 18th and 19th centuries that it really erodes. Somebody like Thomas Carlyle is a product of that, and I think you can see that in his rhetoric and his strong condemnations of the moral plight of the nation has that Puritan fire, and of course he was a big admirer of Oliver Cromwell.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have that from a Scot of that period, but one of the things I think that's quite interesting here is the Puritans very much see themselves as bringing in the true order of society, which is in conformity with the divine, and that all things must conform to that. What we've been talking about with this kind of idea of Merry England, well, you have the great chain of being with the king as the axis mundi, the center, which without the rightful king, the order of society breaks down. But then you have this space, this time period where you allow for I guess the build up of pressure to release, both in terms of the social order and of one's maybe desires, let's say, that they can all be flushed out, and then a return to the order as possible. And so there's that space for chaos built within this great chain of being. Whereas with the Puritan model, there is no space for that that kind of activity. It is just and it's not really tied in with the great chain of being idea either. It's actually an equalizing force of various forms. Puritanism. So I think in a way, although it's reaffirming an order, it's almost I can see why it's upturning to the royalist.
Yes, yeah. It to them, I mean, because for them, throne and altar, and even because the royalists, of course, were largely Anglicans, and they retained many of the forms of traditional Catholicism. I mean, for Puritanism, of course, the idea is you purify the Anglican Church of its vestigial Catholicism. That's what it explicitly refers to. So any leftovers are being kind of purged away. And probably Charles I had, unfortunately, ended up at war because he tried to impose the prayer book in Scotland, and it was kind of tangling with the Scots, this much more serious Puritanism in Scotland that got him into trouble in the first place. Weirdly, though, the same group of people halfway through the conflict kind of decided, the Presbyterians decided, okay, well, we don't actually want our king to be executed, so we're gonna fight back against the English Puritans. So it all got very complicated.
Well, I can't help but see a kind of dividing line between permissiveness on the merrier side, and then almost like a stricter sort of list of the things that are more specifically allowed on the puritanical side. So there's almost like a laissez-faire attitude on one side, where just sort of everything goes to a certain degree, and we'll sort of like work within the context of whatever happens. But then on the other hand, they're kind of trying to, we might say, abstract, but they would probably say, infer theologically or scripturally or something, what a correct conduct is from like more of just an abstract sense. So they're trying to reason in some ways their way into like a perfect code of being, that into a perfect code that everybody will adhere to sort of like improve everything.
Yeah, each side accused the other of innovation. Each side thought that they were more in line with primitive Christianity, as they talked about it then. That the Royalists were traditional and they were in touch with the way things had always been. That the Puritans thought that this was like an encaking of some kind of artifice over time that they had to sweep away. And the Royalists were more kind of confident in their being, because they could rely on this deep sort of theme of tradition, that people kind of knowing what to do, whereas the Puritans were trying to like recover something that they thought was there, but since they didn't really have a true sort of thick tradition that resonated with the people, I think they were more rigid, more brittle, I think is what governing.
Yeah, but in that way, it kind of comes through in through the present, some of this dialectic, you might say, between people who just kind of want to let what happens, and those who want to set a much more prescriptive view of how things should be. But in that way, it becomes something that isn't just a left-right divide, as you were illustrating earlier, Nathan. Is that in that you do get people like Carlyle coming along, who we might say are fellow travelers, but are working from the opposite perspective of venerating people who, at the moment, we would be considering something like the enemy to Merry England. But obviously, there's a way of viewing that is in line with certain traditional values, but it does so in more of a prescriptive way, you might say, rather than just a sort of laissez-faire, let it happen.
I guess, to be fair to Carlyle and Cromwell, that Cromwell was a reactionary compared to a lot of the other smaller, very much more kind of radical and odd groups, including, say, the Fifth Monarchy men, or the Diggers, or the Ranters, or any of these little shards of the Protestant church that sort of smashed and became all these tiny little sects. But Cromwell was kind of creating some sort of order out of all that chaos, and things could have kept getting kind of where they could get increasingly crazy. And so comparatively, I suppose he was like a king sort of figure comparatively.
In some sense, yes, but it does feel a little bit like saying that Robespierre was a moderate in his own context.
No. I mean, I have a friend who likes both. Well, I think he's probably a friend of you guys as well, Plantagenet. He likes both Charles I and Cromwell. And I think it's partly because these men are so amazingly, they're such incredible figures compared to the sort of leaders that we have today. Both of them, it's hard, not to respect them, right? Both of them, but he loves both of them. But he wants to. He says he's gonna convince me sooner or later that Cromwell is like based and his aesthetic vision is so far from I mean Cromwell's aesthetic vision is so far from mine that I'm so resentful about them having executed the king. I'm truly resentful about this. So I don't think I'm.
Yeah, I mean that is the thing though, is that I do wonder if not only is this a conflict that goes much further back than we're currently giving it credit for, because I would as I was sort of briefly bringing up earlier, there was the attempted ban on football because it was interfering with archery practice. Obviously, that goes much further back, and so you could talk about figures like Henry V being an almost pseudo Cromwellian figure in a similar kind of way, where perhaps some other, I can't necessarily think of any monarchs specifically who would fulfill more of the, you could say, Falstaffian type, or the more merry type in quite the same way, but it does sort of feel like it's a distinction that goes much further back, but it becomes much more clear after the Reformation.
Henry IV, before he actually became king. I mean, I just remember in the play he's kind of fooling around with Falstaff, and then eventually has to put childish things away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so you see that then these two masculinities again, right? So he's Hal before he becomes king, right? He's Prince Hal. He's having a good time. He's boasting and having a kind of insulting matches with Falstaff and playing pranks upon him. But when he has to become king, when he has to become the father of the nation, all of that disappears essentially, or gets channeled into his military conquests of France, I suppose, in Henry V.
But then to kind of take that point a little bit further, maybe that is a character that is sort of illustrative of a theme that runs through the English more generally, in that there is a call or a pull to fulfill both of those archetypes to some degree. So you need to simultaneously be puritanical in the way that you approach work, perhaps, and merry in the way that you approach your merriment and leisure.
Yes, I would agree with that. I sometimes wonder whether the Puritans didn't all go to America, or most of them anyway. Leaving behind the ones who just didn't really. I mean, there were a few left behind, but yeah, a lot of them went to America, right?
Yeah.
I wonder as well. So Hazlitt has this idea. He talks about English humor during this essay, and I won't go into the whole passage, but essentially he sees the English as having an innocence and a native wildness to them, as he would say, a certain rusticity. And for him, humor really relies upon the strange. So you're not used to something and it appears absurd, and so you just laugh at it instinctually. So when you, in the pantomime, you were mentioning this idea earlier, Rupert, with the certain ladies of Misrule actually being like really butch men with big beards in dresses. It just, you would never see that in normal life in medieval England, right? So it just looks absurd. So you just can't help but laughing. And for him, the English seem to have this kind of childlikeness to them, where there's a wonder and I guess a certain ignorance, but then that leads into a love of nonsense. He says that you won't find a nation which loves more nonsensical things than the English. You mentioned Spitting Image, which is a bunch of puppets mocking our political leaders. You have the pantomime. You have children's TV shows where they pour gunge upon, various contestants, and this is supposed to be like entertaining. But if you do that in this country, you'll probably, and the music hall tradition and things like this, Punch and Judy, silliness is something that appeals in this country in a way that I'm not sure that, I've not done a survey of the world's comedy, but I'm not aware of it being a major feature in other countries, as the pie in the face might be here.
Well, another important point is that he emphasizes that it's quite earnest and genuine as well. It's not something. So our humor is something which is not necessarily pretentious, which he seems to imply is a feature of the humor of some other continental countries. That we will quite readily embrace the silly in a very earnest way.
Yeah, I wonder how it applies to sort of political satire and the mocking of the of authority. Just in the, it's kind of, you know, I mean, now it seems like this is the thing that politicians fear the most, or these people fear the most, is to be laughed at.
Yeah, well, I mean, perhaps part of the problem there is that there's so unlike lords of previous times, their public persona is basically what they're resting on for their legitimacy and their position, and so it becomes something that is very fragile and cannot be mocked and cannot be copied in an obviously satirical way. So, you know, they have to protect their image a lot more. Whereas in the past, if a position is held indisputably and cannot be challenged just on popularity grounds, then you can allow something like a Lord of Misrule.
You do have, though, the only example I can think of in modern times who kind of embraced this is actually Boris Johnson. I remember when he got stuck on a zip wire waving flags, and he looked absolutely ridiculous, but he embraced it. And, you know, with his shaggy hair and his kind of ridiculous over the top language, he was presenting a kind of clownish figure to the nation. And for whatever reason, he appealed to a lot of people, regardless of his policies. By and large, he seemed to kind of be somebody your average person was like, yeah, he's a good guy. And I wonder if that clownishness and nonsensical aspect to him was something that actually appealed.
Well, more than that, I wonder if it's something that we've kind of lost, and that's possibly why he was so popular, is because he was finally something that that the English could actually recognize that they'd been sort of missing for so long, because it does seem like a lot of more modern humor, at least at the more broadcasted and official levels, is more full of pretensions and considerations about what happens outside the joke.
I mean, it's such a sad kind of situation that Boris Johnson ended up in, you know, because he went in as he was a Falstaffian figure, and there was a famous picture of him with Corbyn and the two of them walking in. Boris Johnson had just had a massive political triumph, so naturally enough, he looked quite happy and extra Falstaffian, and Corbyn looked extra sour. But then for him to like go into government and then be the one who canceled Christmas, I mean, you know, because of the lockdowns, right? I'm pretty sure he wasn't happy with that, right? Like being the person who canceled Christmas.
I think the generally accepted narrative is that all that was sort of forced on him, and it was all quite reluctant. He would have rather again conformed to this. Yeah,
is this the image?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean.
And that again, if we're rolling with this idea of a laissez-faire attitude, then he was very much more in that attitude of just let things play themselves out, and we'll try to govern as little as possible.
Yeah, I wanted to believe that was his deepest impulse, but I do think he has let us down in other ways that are hard to forgive. But yes, I mean, this man encapsulated, and it was, I think, John Mortimer, the man who wrote Rumpole of the Bailey. He is kind of a champagne socialist type, but he always made the argument that England was still divided into Cavaliers and Roundheads, and it wasn't a left-right thing, that there could be left-wing Cavaliers and right-wing Roundheads and right-wing and both, right? Because it didn't really break down on strict political lines, but there's kind of a Cavalier spirit around and a a kind of puritanical spirit around which kind of manifests itself. And I think, yeah, Corbin definitely looked like Malvolio in Twelfth Night, who is the ultimate like sour kind of figure. I feel a bit sorry for him.
And Boris is definitely a Sir Toby Belch
Yeah.
figure on
Yeah.
that front. I wanted to just read a short passage from George Orwell's essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, because when I was reading Hazlitt's list of all the amusements that the English love, I was reminded of this aspect of Orwell, and I think it connects with what you've been saying, Rupert, about the sort of laissez-faire aspect of these of Merry England. But here it is worth noting a minor English trait which is extremely well marked, though not often commented on, and that is a love of flowers. This is one of the first things that one notices when one reaches England from abroad, especially if one is coming from southern Europe. Does it not contradict the English indifference to the arts? Not really, because it is found in people who have no aesthetic feeling whatever. What it does link up with, however, is another English characteristic which is so much a part of us that we barely notice it, and that is the addiction to hobbies and spare time occupations, the privateness of English life. We are a nation of flower lovers, but also a nation of stamp collectors, pigeon fanciers, amateur carpenters, coupon snippers, dart players, crossword puzzle fans. All the culture that is most truly native centers round things which, even when they are communal, are not official. The pub, the football match, the back garden, the fireside, and the nice cup of tea. The liberty of the individual is still believed in, almost as in the 19th century. But this has nothing to do with economic liberty, the right to exploit others for profit. It is the liberty to have a home of your own, to do what you like in your spare time, to choose your own amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. The most hateful of all names in an English ear is Nosy Parker. It is obvious, of course, that even this purely private liberty is a lost cause. Like all other modern people, the English are in process of being numbered, labelled, conscripted, and coordinated. And he was writing this in the 1930s/40s. I mean, how true is that today in terms of having lost that? But I was very struck by this sense of it's not just that we like amusements and hobbies, but it's this idea that there's a sphere of work or maybe being managed, but then we need a sphere and desire a sphere where we can pursue our own interests and delights and not be told what to do about them.
So adorable. I saw the most wonderful play recently, Jerusalem. You know about this play?
I'm not familiar, I'm afraid.
It's about a it's kind of, and it does transcend the left-right thing again, but it's about this kind of gypsy green man type figure who lives in a trailer in a caravan in the forest, and he kind of has parties and things, but he's being driven out by the health and safety crowd who are kind of coming with their clipboards, and they're going to get rid of him eventually, and there's this real tension there between that sort of that very kind of individualistic kind of free guy who's not free to make money, he's free not to make money, this guy. But it really, I thought it was, take any chance to see it. It's got Mark Rylance is kind of the one who plays the character, and he's very, very English and very lovely and appealing play.
Sounds fantastic. I'll need to check it out.
It's really, really, really good.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for it. I must say, I was also reminded of so you mentioned that was a sentiment in the 30s or the 40s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I can't help but see echoes of the original contentions of the arts and crafts movement as well, which is early to mid 19th century, I believe. And so, this is a contention that's kind of been in play ever since the the pretty early days of the Industrial Revolution, the sense of everything being much too managed for many people's likings, even though quite a lot of the figures who were making up that movement were in the same sort of vein as William Morris and much more of an egalitarian, liberalizing in the political sense kind of mindset. So they sort of saw their way out of things as more political egalitarianism.
Yeah, and yet what what Morris loved was a hierarchical society, which yet it's. I mean, I would compare this to. I'm a big fan of Chesterton's idea of distributism, to go back to the man with his, free to pursue his liberty in his home. Right, he's very much the, man's home is his castle, and the concept of 3 acres and a cow. And Chesterton's sort of one of the ultimate, Falstaffian English figures as well, isn't he? Who is deeply in touch with the tradition we're talking about.
Even in terms of visage.
Yeah. You just evoke, as soon as you see him, you know what you're dealing with. He just evokes this tradition. But he felt he was at war, but in the most jolly sort of way with the progressives of his time, who had these impulses that are so alarming, right? The scientism and this kind of humorless feminism and all this, When you read it, you feel like the way he talks, you'd think that he was dealing with the same exact thing we're dealing with today, and he was in embryo. He really was in embryo, with the same sort of grim kind of scientific determination to reduce everything.
Well, you see this across a number of writers of that period who belong to a number of different positions. So Orwell with 1984, Huxley with A Brave New World. You have Tolkien and the scouring of the Shire. The Shire is very much, I think, Merry England to a certain extent, delight in big parties and eating food. And, they work hard, but they party very hard too. You have C.S. Lewis and That Hideous Strength, where you have this kind of the seed of England, Avalon as he will call it, which is being crushed by scientific materialism, which seeks to control all of human life and perfect it for a certain end. All of these thinkers, they don't agree theologically on every point or politically, but they share a certain attitude of what's being lost to modernity, what's being lost to this ideology, and they all would line up on the other side. And I find it interesting that so many dystopian novels emerge just at that same point from across the spectrum. It seems like it's as you're both saying, it's not an explicit set of political beliefs. It's a lower, deeper, intuitive or attitude, a sense about what's right and wrong.
Yes. Another figure that came into my mind was people know Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. It's kind of a wild ride of an 18th century novel, but there's a figure in there who's a hobbyist, and he's always riding his hobby horse. His hobby horse is making kind of out in his garden, making kind of it's like battlements or something, like he's reconstructing some kind of military, battlements in his garden, and sort of obsessively kind of, creating all this stuff. And it's another one of these kind of, I suppose, the English eccentric personified. That's an interesting book if people can it's full of digression. So the whole thing is, it starts off and it just completely, a lot of postmodernists use it as a model. I know that's not a great recommendation, but because it is such a strange kind of inversion of narrative, but it has a kind of carnivalesque dimension to it because of that. Because in the 18th century, there's this kind of, almost like a, hyper realistic approach to fiction that was starting, and this kind of broke all that strictness of realism.
Well, I mean, this kind of goes back to the point of sometimes this same sentiment that we're sort of gesturing towards can be carried along in unexpected places, such as the postmodernists, because they do very much take this attitude, and sometimes they take it in some rather distasteful directions. But this idea of don't manage things too much. So even if that comes into the literature sphere, just necessarily perhaps don't manage it all too much. Just sort of let things go as they ought.
I guess some people see that there might be some use in postmodernism in some sense, in that it is a critique of modernism, right? Even if it's sometimes like not a very helpful critique of modernism, it might sometimes be used in some aspects of that theory might be used in a reactionary kind of context, I think.
Yes, well, I guess you could probably quite easily argue that someone like Heidegger, who was famously very much not on the left, was kind of one of the founding figures of postmodern philosophy in some ways. So, yeah, illustrative of the point.
Well, and I guess one of the kind of insights of postmodernism is everybody has a perspective and they're coming from somewhere. And one of the kind of motivations behind this series is there seems to, there's many people around the world are allowed to have a perspective, but the English are not allowed to acknowledge their own perspective, or aren't aware of it, or haven't been, don't see explicitly what's there that's distinctively English. So I think one of the tools of it, and I think somebody like Carl Benjamin has mentioned this, is to really to embrace that aspect and say, well, I'm coming from an English perspective or a British perspective, and this is what I belong to, and this is how I see the world and the values that belong with it. So I think there's value in that aspect of it.
Well, there's quite often in all the different topics that we've been talking about. I've certainly noticed it in myself, becoming very conscious of what the English way is on certain things, but not necessarily being too overly concerned with how that compares with other countries and other cultures. So there might be some vague sense about what other people over on the continent are doing, but what really matters is perhaps the conflicts in ourselves, as the English, what kind of internal conflicts we have, and what our perspective is from a distinctively much more English perspective. Not trying to aggregate it too much out to mankind's tendencies, or even just European tendencies or whatever.
So I think we've got about 10 to 15 minutes to go to the end of the stream.
Sorry. I seem to.
Sorry, you cut out there, Justine.
I was going to say I have to jump off soon, but
can you stay for another 10 minutes or so?
Yep. I think my connection is also bad. But yes.
Right, well, you're back now. Hopefully, you'll last for another 10. Okay. So one aspect I wanted to briefly touch on, because we've touched on a lot of the broad themes to do with Merry England and Merry Christmas, but I wanted to focus on one aspect in particular to give some concreteness to it, because one of the things that struck me throughout this discussion is Merry England isn't an abstract idea. It's not just an abstract joy. It's enjoying simple pleasures like food and ale and singing and dancing and so on. It's very kind of immediate experience, and I think you see that with the tradition of the Wassail, or the Wassail bowl and cup. And so just before we get into that in proper, I did a little song for it to give people a feel of Merry England rather than just hearing about what Merry England's all about. So hopefully this works. Here we come a wassailing among the leaves so green. Here we come a wandering so fair to be seen. Darling boy, come to you, and to you a wassail too. And God bless you and send you a happy new year. And God send you a happy new year. Good master and good mistress, while you're sitting by the fire, pray for us poor children, no wandering in the mire. Love and joy come to you, and to you a wassail too. And God bless you and send you a happy new year. And God send you a happy new year. So this would have been this is an old song which kind of characterizes the Wassail tradition. There's two versions of the Wassail tradition. One is that you're with your family on 12th night, and the Wassail would be this special kind of brew. I think it's a mixture of mulled ale. I think eggs feature in there somewhere. I'm going to post a recipe in the chat so that people can make it if you want. And using the wassail bowl, which would often be made of the maple tree, the white maple tree, as the song goes, and it could hold up to 10 gallons. I think the St. John's College has one which holds up to 10 gallons of this ale. You would pass it around, and you would drink together. And this tradition goes back allegedly to Rowena, who toasted Vortigern in Saxon times with Wassail, which means good health. And then you would reply, drink hail, so drink to your health. But then the other side of it is, particularly in the south west, I think, down in like Cornwall and Dorset and these places, villagers would go around a town together, and they would go to various apple trees or orchards. They would elect a king or queen of the wassail, and they would be going around singing, dancing along to these songs. And when they get to the trees, they would lift the king or queen into the branches and offer some of the wassail to the tree to scare off the evil spirits, so that it would be ready to grow and produce fruit after 12th night, back to work. So you have these two kind of intermixing traditions, and the strong emphasis then on the alcohol that's being consumed, but then its connection to the land, to the community. It's a communal event, and also going back out from this Christmas period, Christmas tide, into the rest of the calendar.
And the connection between man and nature, they're like a deep connection to the harvest, to nature as a source of food, not just something out there behind a screen.
Albeit it does also have a distinctly, it sounds to me at least, like it has a distinctly pre-Christian kind of flavor to it as well. So something that's very old and very very deep-seated.
What I love about these traditions is they're so layered, and I don't think there's a conflict between, it's kind of like in Tolkien, the way he manages to integrate like pagan tradition with Christianity in a way that is works together, very beautiful. Brings to mind.
Sorry, go ahead, Justine.
Oh, just the hymn Jesus Christ, the Apple Tree. It's a beautiful song.
I think as well, so you have this idea during this period that drinking from the cup of reconciliation. So, and I only really know this in a Scottish context, but I would imagine there's similarities in England. When two clans were, they might have been feuding for a time, to reconcile, they would drink from the same cup and pass this round. First the two lords or the leaders of their clans, and then down the hierarchy they would go. And there's this, and then this gets transposed actually in the Reformation in Scotland, because the same cup gets used for, they get rid of the chalice, the Catholic chalice, and they use the same cup that they would have used for the reconciliation as round the Lord's Supper. And there's almost a sense to me that the wassail bowl, in a sense, is that extension of peace around the community, that we're reaffirming our reconciliation and ties together. And any dissension that we've had, well, it's gone now. We've shared the one cup together. Just before we finish up, we've got one super chat. From Samuel Westlake for £5. Thank you very much, Samuel. Very kind of you. Merry Christmas, Nathan and friends. I found particular inspiration in your streams during the last year. Thank you, Samuel. Well, thank you for tuning in, and thank you to everybody else who's been tuning in. It means a lot, and I'm glad that many of you are finding it interesting and stimulating. I think the English restoration ones have been particularly stimulating for me and interesting and inspiring. While we're wrapping up, Justine's dropped out. Maybe she'll come back. We'll see. Hopefully she will. But Rupert, is there any final comments you wanted to make about Merry England?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
So what's sort of coming to mind, especially on the back of that super chat, is just the sense in which we're building up a more complete picture of what the I suppose archetypal Englishman is in this like more traditional sense. So what we're taking from Merry England. So one thing that we didn't get to touch on properly, but I think is quite important, is the sense in which Merry England is kind of something that you already know as an Englishman, but you don't necessarily need to have it explained to you. But when it is laid out in front of you, then it sort of makes a lot more sense. So this idea of genuine merrymaking and honesty and good humor, indulgence in vices to an extent of moderation, but being tolerated and doing so in a fairly like organic fashion that is not overtly subversive. So you might satirize the Lord. You might be drinking on church grounds. You might be making merry with your friends in a sporting competition, but it's all done under the auspices and with permission and acceptance and good humor of the authorities and sort of everyone in the community. So there's a sense in which not only you can sort of let off steam, but you can kind of make up the other half of perhaps the more puritanical side of the English sensibility, which is very much more in the hard-working sense and the moral strictness that can come out in the very dutiful approach to a lot of tasks, even perhaps just something that might be a hobby. Staying true to something in a very, very dutiful way, even though you're not doing so as like an overt job, but then allowing yourself to go out and be merry again and enjoy all of the again, vice seems like the wrong word, but all of the enjoyments.
Yeah, I guess and enjoying a lot of the simple pleasures, I think, is something that's come across to me through this stream. It's not just the high and mighty kind of reading the Iliad or going to the opera, but it's actually just enjoying going for a walk in the countryside or going fishing, or the football or something like that. Is very it's not something to be ashamed of, actually.
And it's not prescriptive. I mean, I suppose it's something that comes a little bit unnaturally in terms of the wider sort of philosophies of some of our sphere. But the idea that some of these things can come fairly naturally to basically all involved, because you don't need to think too hard about the kind of things that you laugh at and what you joke about and how you enjoy your time. You just engage in the festivities as they're presented to you.
Indeed. And so I hope this Christmas people just do that too, who are watching the stream, and really just embrace it and treat it in that way, that it's not a duty, but it's something that you can just enjoy and allow it to organically grow, rather than feel prescribed to enjoy it in a certain way or do X, Y, and Z. And then and maybe over the next year, as we moving into 2023, this will be something we'll return to, I'm sure, in future streams, but perhaps beyond this kind of series, thinking about what would that look like if we wanted to restore some of that within our society, which I think amongst all the panelists today, we've agreed that it's something which has been very much stifled by modernity, by bureaucracy. In particular, in the last few years, there seems to be much more management of our whole lives, whether it's in terms of health or in the way we speak, or in terms of just what we're allowed to enjoy. How can we recover that aspect to our society?
Well, mercifully, I would say that we've been allowed Christmas to continue more or less seemingly unchanged. It's received some battering. The traditions have in slightly more recent years, one might say, but just in a modern context, it might be something like restoring the Christmas spirit to more of an all year round kind of context. So taking the Christmas spirit with you into summer, for example, and not just having it relegated to one day or one weekend a year, but being able to carry that spirit of carefree joy further throughout the year, and try to revive Merry England that way, and just enjoy simple things. And there's a pretty good comment actually that I'm looking at by the Right Honourable Fez that I think illustrates the point, is just being able, just allowing things to be all in good fun.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a lovely way to end this conversation. Rupert, is there anything you would like to promote?
Probably just my Twitter, where I have recently released a pretty extensive thread on the Russian revolutions and the presence of the intelligence services and how they influenced the outcome of events. Draw your own conclusions as to how that might be relevant to the current times. And I might even be appearing on Semiagog's channel to talk about that further on Thursday. I need to confirm that, but yeah, that should be interesting to get more into depth on that particular topic.
That would be good.
Other than that, there's also an article that is also linked on my Twitter, which is called I can't actually remember what it's called. Ideological Amnesia, and that's on Praxarchy. So go and give that a look, about the formations of various ideologies.
Super, Justine. Great that you could return. We're just
sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry. We would just. Sorry, go ahead, Justine.
You all saying good night?
Yes. Yeah, just in time to promote your lovely YouTube channel.
Yeah, so is there anything you would like to...
Yes, please come and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Justine Brown's Bookshelf. So got richly illustrated video. Apart from that, oh gosh, it's going again.
Yes, everyone should subscribe to Justine's channel. It's absolutely fantastic, and you will learn so much about the 17th century, and many of the things we've been talking about today, you will find even more about there. So everybody, go ahead after this and check out some of those videos. And for myself, there'll be a stream tomorrow. I haven't quite decided the topic yet, so it might be a bit of a surprise. But there will be a stream tomorrow, 7 o'clock normal time. Is there anything else either of you would like to say before we go?
Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Oh, thank you, Justine and Rupert, for coming on. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
To say Merry Christmas.
Yes,
and a Happy New Year to everybody too,
and a very Merry New Year.
Merry New Year, yes. God bless everyone.